When rendering animations, it is often the case they present many challenges that are very unique for them. Have you ever had that time where you just left your computer, working hours on end on your animation, to only notice later on that you forgot to disable an object, change a property, some bad lighting, or it just didn't seem good in the end? We really understand that feeling. That's why after passing for all these problems ourselves, we decided to create this video, in order to help people that are just starting to work on animations don't do the same mistakes we did in the past. Just a quick note, the software that I'm using is Blender 3D, but all the tips can also be applied to any other 3D software. Just rendering static images is very different from whole animations. Even though animations are a big number of images, when they merge together, they can often present problems you haven't noticed. A big mistake I made at first was treating the whole animation as just my first frame instead of the whole timeline. By taking that into consideration, a good practice to put on is rendering small frames of your whole animation before rendering it all in one go. It will probably only take around 2% of the full time, but that alone can save you a great amount of time. To give a good example, I had this animation I created with a character that moved around the environment, so my lighting for the main pose was very different when she was starting to walk around. So after manually selecting many of the frames of the whole animation, I noticed this would be a good workflow to check a quick view of the entire animation and give me a good idea of the final result. One of the main factors on animations is the speed. You often see animations that just don't seem right because some movements were too slow or too fast. That's why giving a good attention to your preview or solid mode view is also key on animations you create. Checking the difference between your low and high poly mesh is also another great idea, since the proportions, simulations, materials, and many other factors can be very different from the low poly to the high poly. Also remember to enable texture view on your preview, so you also get a better understanding of your whole scene. Renders without denoisers, in almost all cases, leave a big number of random noise that take our attention away. In many cases, even using normal denoisers we have for static images still leaves some level of noise in our animation, and that's even increased when taken into consideration. We will have a lower number of samples, since we can take 10 minutes to render each frame for a project with a deadline in most cases. That's why you would need a specific tool in dealing with that. Big studios like Pixar have already made their own softwares with specific tools in dealing with that, and until recently, it was also only privately used. There are many softwares that can do that kind of work, but for me personally, Shotcut was the one that gave me the best result and is also free to use. I've done many tests using renders without denoising, different types of denoisers, but what gave me the best result was using the open image denoise with the passing of albedo and normal, and after merging the animations into an animation video file, I import the video on Shotcut, add the video filter reduce noise HQ, and add more the temporal property. From my experience, the spatial property has a similar effect of denoising each image individually, and the temporal over the whole animation, which is what we want right now. We all want the animation to be perfect in the end with just a click of the button, but that is often not the case. So if your final product would look good and the people viewing won't even notice, it's perfectly okay to just edit that part out. As I said before, animations are basically chunks of images. There will be even times that an effect you wish you created it in a certain way doesn't work out, and you have to do it differently. In this case, the best thing to do is understand later on why it didn't work out, and learn that for future projects. A good example for me was my introduction for Kaling. The animation render I wish it worked included hair, body, and cloth physics, but most of it was rarely noticed and gave many problems in the end. So I just removed most of it and learned that some collisions could have been better set. A good parallel for rendering animations is 3D printing. For animations it's even easier than that, since you can cut the arrows later on, which you can't do on a 3D print. It needs to redo that part from start. So if you're using the same computer that is rendering, Remember to check every 5 minutes or so, especially when your animation just started to render. You already know by now that animations require way more time than static renders, which is true in almost all cases. Even the biggest studios in the world have to face the time it takes to render their animations. In 1995, Toy Story 1 took 800,000 hours to render the 75 minutes, that is an average of 7 hours per frame. Maybe you're thinking since it was an older technology, the render time was bigger back then, but that is actually the opposite. In 2013, Monster University took 24 hours to render each frame. Even when using 2000 machines, the render period took 2 full years. After hearing that, you might think the only possible animations for an urban computer to render are real-time or very small ones. And even though these are easier to work with, it's still very possible to render ray tracing animations on your day-to-day computer. Some good tips are: you don't need to render everything in one go. There have been many occasions where I combined many takes into one, added some specific effects into one, and faked objects that are very decent. Make your animation based on your hardware capabilities. If your render is thinking 10 GB and your GPU only supports 2, you'll only be able to render through CPU. And that's also only if you have the required memory, and even that, it would take much longer than your GPU. So try to find ways to fake the effects, hide what is not shown on screen, and work with the properties that don't visually change your project. That leads us to the next tip. Increasing your render properties will not necessarily increase quality, but will necessarily affect your render time. Probably the biggest visual and time change of your render is the number of samples, but there are a lot of others like number of light bounces, subdivision level, poly count, texture resolution, and the list goes on. But some of them may not even change your final result and be consuming a lot of your memory and processing speed. If you're starting now and don't feel confident on changing a property, try to leave it as it is and get used to them as you work. A good tip is also to search the result, the main use, and do your own tests on what works best. With that in mind, you should find a good balance of time over quality that also takes your hardware into consideration. A good personal example I have is an old project of a character I did. I only noticed that the hair particles were so numerous and heavy that my GPU didn't have enough memory to render it, so I had to render the image on CPU, which took me around 10 times the time. So after hearing all of this, what is my recommendation for a render time in each frame? Well, that depends. If you don't have a deadline or have a great amount of time, I would say 1 to 3 minutes per frame is normally acceptable. But as I say, that can also depend on your final goal with the project. Maybe that 20 minutes per frame is acceptable in your case, if high quality is the main purpose, or 5 seconds per frame is what you have available right now. In a case of urgency and your project needs to be sent in 24 hours, I would suggest your animation should take no more than 2 to 3 hours to be fully rendered. That should leave some good time for any potential changes, or if there's a need to be redone. But that is just an idea, you should be able to understand your current state of your project. I really hope you have liked all these tips. We are a private studio that have a wide variety of work, so if there is any special topic you would like us to make a video, or you need help in a 3D project, please feel free to comment on the video or send us a message directly in any of our socials. Thanks a lot for watching and good luck on your next project.